My name is Jacob Reed. I only stopped because the old man looked like he was about to fall. That was the truth. I was driving home on a cold Saturday afternoon when I saw him standing beside a pickup truck near the edge of a narrow country road. He was trying to lift a bundle of firewood. Not a small bundle. The kind that would have made a younger man think twice. He was old. Late 70s, maybe older. Gray coat. Work gloves. One hand gripping the wood. The other pressed against the side of the truck like he needed it to stay upright. For a second, I kept driving. Then I looked in the rearview mirror. He bent down again. The wood shifted, and the old man nearly went with it. I hit the brakes. 5 minutes later, I was carrying firewood toward his porch while he walked beside me, insisting he didn't need help. And 5 minutes after that, his front door opened. A young woman stood there holding a coffee mug. She looked at me. Really looked at me. Then every bit of color drained from her face. The mug slipped from her hand. It hit the porch and shattered. Coffee spread across the wooden boards. But she didn't even look down. She just stared at me like she'd seen someone come back from the dead. The old man turned toward her. "Claire." She took one step back. Her lips parted. And then she whispered 5 words that made absolutely no sense. "Grandpa, that's him." I looked behind me. There was nobody there, just me, a stranger carrying firewood on a porch I'd never seen before. I forced a nervous smile. "I'm sorry." My voice sounded strange even to me. "Do we know each other?" The woman didn't answer. She only stared harder, like she was trying to decide whether to scream or cry. That's when I realized something. Whatever this was, whatever she thought she saw in me, it wasn't going to end with firewood. It was going to open a door to a story I didn't know I was already part of. 3 hours earlier, I had no idea that a simple act of kindness would lead me to Claire Morgan, and to the memory of a man I had spent years trying not to talk about. 3 hours earlier, I was driving back from my brother's place just outside Millfield. He'd been trying to convince me to stay for lunch. I told him I had work to catch up on. The truth was, I simply preferred quiet these days. Life looked very different at 35 than I'd imagined when I was 20. I wasn't married. I didn't have children. Most weekends were spent fixing things around my house, reading, or taking long drives through the countryside with no particular destination. Some people called it peaceful. Others would have called it lonely. I wasn't sure which one was more accurate. The November air carried the smell of pine and damp leaves. The trees on both sides of the road had turned shades of gold, orange, and deep red. It was one of those afternoons that made you slow down without realizing it. No traffic, no noise, just winding roads and endless forests. I turned off the main highway to avoid construction. The GPS estimated it would save me 12 minutes. Funny how 12 minutes can change an entire life. About 5 miles later, I noticed an old blue pickup truck parked on the shoulder. Its tailgate was down. Stacks of freshly cut firewood filled the truck bed. Beside it stood an elderly man wearing heavy work gloves and a faded green jacket. He was trying to lift a large bundle of logs onto his shoulder. At first, I didn't think much of it. Plenty of people his age hated asking for help. I figured he'd manage. Then the bundle slipped. Several logs rolled onto the ground. The old man stumbled backward, barely catching himself against the truck. My foot instinctively moved to the brake. I drove another 20 yards, then sighed. You'd never forgive yourself if he got hurt. I made a U-turn. When I pulled up beside him, he looked at me with the cautious expression older people often have when a stranger suddenly stops. I rolled down the window. "Need a hand?" He smiled politely. "I appreciate it, son. But I've still got enough pride left to carry my own firewood." I laughed. "I wasn't questioning your pride. I was questioning your back." That earned the first genuine smile. "You sound like my granddaughter. She worries too much." "I'd say she worries the right amount." He looked at the pile of wood, then back at me. Finally, he sighed. "All right, but only because she'd probably scold me if she knew I refused." I stepped out of the truck. "I'm Jacob." He extended a weathered hand. "Henry Morgan." His handshake was surprisingly firm. We spent the next several minutes loading the fallen logs back into my arms instead of his. "Careful," he said. "Some of those pieces are heavier than they look." I grinned. I'll survive. Henry chuckled. I used to say that at your age. And did you? He looked toward the trees. Mostly. There was something warm about him. The kind of man who could turn an ordinary conversation into one that felt familiar. As we started walking toward the small wooden house tucked among the pines, he nodded toward the chimney. My granddaughter keeps telling me to stop cutting my own firewood. She's probably right. I know. He smiled. But this old place has been heated by that fireplace for 40 years. I suppose some habits are hard to let go. They are. He glanced at me. So, what made you stop? I looked down at the logs in my arms. I honestly don't know. Maybe because I'd hoped someone would stop for me one day. Henry didn't answer immediately. After a few seconds, he simply smiled. The world could use more people who think like that. The gravel driveway crunched beneath our boots. The house wasn't large. It was an old one-story cabin with white wooden siding that had long since faded into a soft gray. A wide front porch wrapped around the front of the house. Stacks of neatly cut firewood were already piled beside the stone chimney. Someone clearly took pride in keeping the place alive. Henry caught me looking. My wife planted every flower you see. I glanced toward the small garden lining the porch. Even in late autumn, someone had carefully covered the flower beds for winter. My granddaughter keeps taking care of them. He smiled. Says grandma would haunt her if she didn't. I laughed. She sounds like a smart woman. The smartest person I know. There wasn't a second of hesitation in his voice. It made me smile. We climbed the porch steps. Henry reached for the front door. Claire. His voice carried easily through the house. Could you open the door? I shifted the firewood in my arms. The logs were heavier than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. A few seconds passed. Then I heard footsteps. Like, quick. The doorknob turned. The door slowly opened. Standing there was a young woman in a cream-colored sweater and blue jeans. Her dark brown hair was loosely tied back. She held a ceramic mug with both hands. She smiled at her grandfather. You're late. Then her eyes moved to me. The smile disappeared instantly. Every muscle in her face froze. Her fingers loosened. The mug slipped from her hands. Crashed against the wooden porch. Coffee splashed across the floorboards. The sound echoed through the quiet afternoon. But Claire didn't even blink. She stared directly at me. Her breathing became uneven, like she'd forgotten how. Henry frowned. Claire. She didn't answer. She kept looking at me. Not at the firewood. Not at the truck. Only at me. I shifted awkwardly. I think your coffee. She never looked down. Her lips trembled. Almost silently, she whispered, No. I exchanged a confused glance with Henry. He looked just as lost as I was. Then Claire took one slow step toward me. Her eyes filled with tears. She searched my face as if she were looking for something she'd lost years ago. Finally, she spoke. Grandpa. Her voice cracked. That's him. A chill ran through me. Henry blinked. Him. Claire slowly nodded. She never took her eyes off me. I forced an uneasy smile. I'm sorry. I think you've mistaken me for someone else. She shook her head immediately. No. Then stopped herself. She looked down for the first time, closed her eyes, took a slow breath. When she looked back up, she seemed embarrassed. I'm so sorry. You just look exactly like someone I used to know. The tension eased, but only slightly. Henry gently placed a hand on her shoulder. You all right, sweetheart? She nodded. Yeah. I just wasn't expecting that. Henry looked at me. I guess we'd better get this firewood inside before it gets any colder. I smiled politely. Probably a good idea. But as I carried the logs toward the woodshed beside the house, I could still feel Claire watching me. And for reasons I couldn't explain, part of me had the strange feeling that she wasn't mistaken at all. When the last piece of firewood was stacked neatly beside the woodshed, I brushed the sawdust from my jacket. Henry smiled with quiet satisfaction. There. That should keep me warm for at least another week. I think it'll keep you warm longer than that. He laughed. I like your optimism. I looked toward the porch. Claire had disappeared inside. For some reason, I found myself wondering if she'd come back out. Henry noticed me glance toward the front door. Don't mind Claire. I looked back at him. She gets embarrassed when she thinks she's made someone uncomfortable. I wasn't uncomfortable. Just confused. Henry nodded slowly. So was I. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. Would you join us for a cup of coffee? Oh, I couldn't. Nonsense. You've done more work in 20 minutes than I've managed all morning. The least I can do is offer you coffee. I smiled. I don't want to interrupt your afternoon. Henry chuckled. My afternoon involved arguing with Firewood. I'd say you've already improved it. That made both of us laugh. Come on. My granddaughter makes the best apple pie in the county. I've heard that claim before. Oh, usually from grandfathers. This one's true. I suppose I have to find out. The house smelled exactly the way you'd expect. Fresh coffee, cinnamon, old books, and burning oak from the fireplace. It didn't feel like walking into a stranger's home. It felt like walking into a place where people still sat together for dinner every evening. Family photographs covered one wall. Some were old enough to have faded around the edges. Others looked more recent. Henry noticed me looking. My whole life is on that wall. I like that. My granddaughter says I should switch to digital frames. And I told her those things don't have fingerprints. I smiled. Fair argument. Claire stepped into the living room carrying a tray. She had changed into a dark green sweater. Her expression was calmer now. But every few seconds, she caught herself looking at me again, almost like she couldn't help it. She placed 3 coffee mugs on the table. I'm sorry about earlier. It's all right. No, it really isn't. She looked genuinely embarrassed. I must have looked completely crazy. I smiled. I've had stranger welcomes. That finally made her laugh. Quiet, nervous laugh. I'm Claire. She extended her hand. Jacob. The moment our hands touched, she hesitated. Only for half a second. But I noticed. So did she. She quickly let go. Henry pretended not to notice the awkward silence. So, Jacob, what do you do? I'm an architect. Henry nodded approvingly. That explains why you looked at my porch before you looked at me. I laughed. Was it that obvious? Claire smiled into her coffee. A little. I was wondering if anyone else noticed. Oh, I noticed. She looked at the old wooden beams overhead. You spent almost a minute studying the ceiling. I laughed again. I wasn't judging it. You were. I was appreciating it. That's what architects say when they're judging. For the first time since I'd arrived, the conversation felt normal, easy, comfortable. But every now and then, I catch Claire looking at me with that same distant expression, like she was comparing my face to someone she still couldn't forget. Henry disappeared into the kitchen to grab the pie. The moment he was out of the room, the silence returned. Claire looked down at her coffee. I waited. It felt like she wanted to say something but couldn't decide whether she should. Finally, she spoke. Can I ask you a strange question? I smiled. After today, I don't think anything would surprise me. She gave a small nervous laugh. When's your birthday? I blinked. That's definitely unexpected. I know. But would you mind telling me? April 17th. She slowly nodded, almost as if she just crossed something off a list in her mind. And where did you grow up? Just outside Cedar Falls. What about college? State University. What? She looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I sound like I'm interviewing you. A little. She covered her face for a second. I'm really sorry. It's okay. I just needed to know. Know what? She looked at me. For several seconds, she didn't answer. Then quietly said, You remind me of someone. I smiled politely. You mentioned that. She nodded. But it's more than that. The way you smile. The way you talk. Even the way you laugh. My smile slowly faded. Who was he? She looked toward the family photographs hanging above the fireplace. I'll tell you. But not today. Before I could ask another question, Henry walked back into the room carrying 3 plates with large slices of homemade apple pie. I hope everyone's hungry. Claire smiled immediately. You cut them way too big. Henry looked offended. There is no such thing as too much pie. I laughed. I think I'm on Henry's side. He pointed his fork toward me. I knew I liked you. The conversation drifted to lighter topics. Henry told stories about the house. He had built most of it himself nearly 40 years earlier. Every room carried a memory. The porch used to be half this size. He pointed toward the window. My wife wanted enough space for rocking chairs. So I built it twice. Claire smiled. Grandma always said Grandpa never knew when to stop improving something. Henry chuckled. She's right. He looked around the room. I still don't. After dessert, I thanked them for the coffee and stood up. I should probably head home. Henry walked me to the front door. Jacob, if you're ever driving this way again, stop by. I mean that. I will. Claire quietly followed us onto the porch. The afternoon sun had started to disappear behind the trees. The air felt colder now. I reached my truck, opened the driver's door, then heard footsteps behind me. Jacob. I turned around. Claire was standing only a few feet away. She looked nervous again. I know this is going to sound strange, but would you come back tomorrow? I frowned. Tomorrow? She nodded. I'd like to show you something. What is it? She looked down for a moment, then back into my eyes. Something I've kept for almost 20 years. I smiled. Does it have anything to do with the man you think I look like? She didn't answer. Instead, she gave the smallest nod. I think, once you see it, you'll understand why I froze when I opened that door. I drove away with more questions than answers. The logical part of my mind kept telling me it was all a coincidence. But another part of me, the part that couldn't stop thinking about the look in Claire's eyes, already knew I'd be back the next day. I barely slept that night, not because I believed in fate, not because I thought Claire had somehow mistaken me for a long-lost friend, but because I couldn't stop thinking about her face. It wasn't just surprise. It wasn't fear. It looked more like hope, the kind of hope someone carries for years, convincing themselves they'll never feel it again. And then, somehow, it appears standing on the front porch carrying a stack of firewood. The next morning, I found myself taking the same country road. I told myself it was out of curiosity. That wasn't entirely true. Part of me genuinely wanted to know if Henry was all right. The other part wanted to see Claire again. When I pulled into the driveway, Henry was sitting on the porch wrapped in a thick blanket, reading the newspaper. He looked up and smiled. I was beginning to think she'd scared you away. I laughed. It takes more than a dropped coffee mug. He folded the newspaper. Good. Because she's been looking out that window every 15 minutes. I looked toward the house. Sure enough, the curtain moved. Just a little. Henry chuckled. I told her you'd come. You sounded pretty confident. I've lived almost 80 years. You learn to recognize when two people are about to change each other's lives. I smiled. That's a lot of pressure. It isn't pressure. It's experience. The front door opened before I even reached the porch. Claire stepped outside. This time there was no surprise, only a nervous smile. Hi. Hi. I'm glad you came. I was curious. She laughed softly. I figured. Henry stood up. I'll leave you two alone. Claire looked at him. You don't have to. I know. But I think I should. He disappeared inside, closing the screen door behind him. Claire looked toward the forest for a moment before speaking. Come with me. Where? The barn. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds mysterious. It is. We walked across the yard in silence. The old red barn stood behind the house. It had probably been there longer than I had been alive. Claire unlocked the wooden door. The smell of old timber and hay filled the air. Dust floated through the beams of sunlight coming through the cracks. She walked to an old cabinet in the corner, opened the bottom drawer, carefully pulled out a small wooden box. She held it for a second without saying anything, then handed it to me. I think it's time you saw this. I slowly lifted the lid. Inside were dozens of photographs, letters tied together with a faded blue ribbon, a silver pocket watch, and, resting on top of everything else, picture. The moment I picked it up, my heart stopped. The man smiling in the photograph looked almost exactly like me. Same eyes, same smile, same jawline. For a split second, felt like I was looking at myself. But I knew I wasn't, because I recognized him immediately. I whispered his name before I even realized I was speaking. Michael. Claire looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. So, I wasn't imagining it. I slowly lowered the photograph. Michael Reed, my older brother, gone for almost 8 years. The reason I'd driven through life avoiding conversations about my past. The reason I hadn't recognized the look on Claire's face yesterday was because she hadn't been looking at me. She'd been looking at the man she thought she'd never see again. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I couldn't take my eyes off the photograph. Michael looked exactly the way I remembered him. The same crooked smile. The same denim jacket he'd worn almost every fall. The same watch on his wrist. Only now, someone else had been carrying that memory all these years. Claire carefully sat down on an old wooden bench. I was 12. Her voice was barely above a whisper. I'd gone hiking with Grandpa. It started raining. I wandered farther into the woods than I should have. She smiled sadly. I thought I knew the trail. You got lost. She nodded. For hours. I remember getting colder. I remember crying. And then, she looked at the photograph. He found me. I swallowed hard. Michael had always been that kind of person. If someone needed help, he never walked away. He stayed with me until the search team arrived. Claire continued. He gave me his jacket because I was freezing. He made a small fire. He kept telling jokes even though I could tell he was worried. A tear rolled down her cheek. He never let me think we weren't going to make it. I smiled without realizing it. That sounds exactly like him. Claire looked at me. He never told me his full name. Only Michael. I was too young to ask anything else. After that day, I never saw him again. I carefully turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded handwriting, were 5 words. Keep smiling, little explorer. I froze. Claire noticed. What is it? I showed her the back. She smiled through her tears. He wrote that before he left. I've read those words 1,000 times. I laughed quietly. So that's where he got it. She looked confused. What do you mean? When I was 10. He used to say that to me every morning before school. I smiled at the memory. Keep smiling, little brother. He never changed. Claire wiped another tear away. No. He didn't. She stood and walked toward an old shelf in the corner of the barn. There was something else. She picked up a faded blue backpack. The rescue team found this a week later. She unzipped it. Inside was an old compass, a flashlight, paperback novel, and a folded map. I recognized the map immediately. My father had given one just like it to Michael for his 18th birthday. I looked at Claire. You kept all of this? She nodded. Grandpa wanted to return it, but we had no idea who Michael was. There was no address, no phone number, no last name. So, I kept hoping we'd meet again. I smiled sadly. And yesterday, you thought I was him. Claire looked down. For 1 second. I really did. She laughed softly through her tears. I know that sounds impossible. No, I said quietly. It sounds human. We walked back toward the house together. Neither of us felt the need to rush the conversation. There was something strangely comforting about talking about Michael. For years, I'd avoided saying his name because it hurt too much. Now, for the first time, someone else was helping me remember him with a smile instead of only with grief. As we reached the porch, Henry was waiting with 3 steaming mugs of coffee. He looked from Claire to me, and then smiled. I had a feeling the box answered a few questions. Claire nodded. It answered one, and created 10 more. Henry laughed. That's usually how the best stories begin. Henry handed me a mug of coffee. I figured the 2 of you could use something warm. I accepted it with a grateful smile. Thank you. We settled into the old rocking chairs on the porch. The forest stretched out before us, quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. For a while, nobody spoke. It didn't feel awkward. It felt respectful, like Michael deserved a few moments of silence. Finally, Henry cleared his throat. You know, I've heard Claire talk about Michael for almost 15 years. I looked at him. She never forgot him. Henry smiled at his granddaughter. She couldn't. Claire looked embarrassed. I tried. But every birthday, every Thanksgiving, every Christmas, I wondered if he was happy, if he had a family, if he'd ever think about that little girl who got lost in the woods. She laughed quietly. I guess I never imagined I'd meet his brother instead. I took another sip of coffee. There are a lot of things you don't know about Michael. Claire looked at me. I'd like to. I smiled. When we were kids, he was always getting into trouble. Henry laughed. I don't believe that. Oh, it's true. He once climbed onto the roof because he thought he could fix a satellite antenna. Claire smiled. Could he? No. He fell into Mom's flower garden. All three of us laughed. And when I was 9, I was terrified of riding a bicycle. He spent 3 straight weekends teaching me. He never got angry, even after I crashed into his mailbox. Claire laughed harder. He sounds exactly how I imagined. He was. I looked down at my mug. He made everyone around him feel safe. Claire's smile slowly faded. I wish I'd had the chance to thank him. You just did. She looked confused. I smiled gently. You've spent 15 years remembering a man who helped you for one afternoon. Most people are forgotten much sooner than that. She didn't answer, but I could see tears forming again. They're happy tears, she whispered. I know. The afternoon slipped by without any of us noticing. Before I realized it, the sun was already beginning to set. Orange light filtered through the pine trees surrounding the house. I stood. I should probably get going. Henry looked disappointed. So soon. I've already stolen half your day. You've improved it. He reached out and shook my hand again. You're welcome here anytime, Jacob. I mean that. I know. Then I turned toward Claire. It was nice meeting you. She smiled. It wasn't just nice. It was unexpected. I laughed. I can't argue with that. As I reached my truck, I heard her call my name. Jacob. I turned around. She was standing at the edge of the porch. Would you? She hesitated. Like to have dinner with us next Friday? I smiled. I thought I was only invited for coffee. Henry called from behind her. That's because I hadn't tasted your company yet. Claire rolled her eyes. Grandpa. He grinned. What? I like the kid. I couldn't help laughing. I'd love to come. Claire's smile grew just a little wider. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Henry was waving from the porch. Claire stood beside him. She wasn't looking at the road. She was watching my truck disappear between the trees. And for the first time in years, driving home didn't feel like returning to an empty house. It felt like I was already looking forward to coming back. Friday arrived much faster than I expected. I caught myself checking the clock more than once that afternoon. Felt ridiculous. I was 35 years old. It wasn't a first date. It wasn't even really a date. It was dinner with an elderly man and his granddaughter. So why was I changing my shirt for the 3rd time? I laughed at myself. Get it together, Jacob. The drive to Henry's house felt shorter than usual. When I turned into the driveway, the porch light had already been switched on. Claire opened the door before I even knocked. She smiled. You actually came. I said I would. I know. She stepped aside. I was just making sure. The smell of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and herbs filled the house. Henry's voice came from the dining room. Jacob, if you're late, I'm eating your dessert. I laughed. I'll keep that in mind. Dinner felt surprisingly natural. Henry told another dozen stories from his younger days. Most of them became more dramatic every time he told them. Claire noticed me smiling. Don't believe everything he says. Henry looked offended. Every word is true. Claire raised an eyebrow. So you really chased a bear away with a broom? Henry pointed his fork toward her. It wasn't a big bear. I couldn't stop laughing. That somehow makes it more believable. It happened. Claire leaned closer to me. He actually scared himself more than the bear. I heard that. You were supposed to. After dinner, Henry stood up slowly. My knees are reminding me how old I am. Claire smiled. I'll clean up. I stood. I'll help. She shook her head. Only if you dry the dishes. I can handle that. Henry grinned. That's how it starts. What starts? You help with the dishes. Next thing you know, you're arguing about where the frying pans belong. Claire laughed. Grandpa. What? I've lived long enough to recognize these things. 20 minutes later, the kitchen was quiet except for the sound of running water. Claire washed. I dried. Every now and then our hands brushed as she passed me another plate. Neither of us pulled away too quickly. Finally, she broke the silence. Can I ask you something? Sure. When was the last time you laughed this much? I thought about it. Longer than I expected. I honestly don't know. She looked at me. I noticed. What? The first day you came here. You smiled. But your eyes didn't. I stopped drying the plate. Nobody had ever said that to me before. She continued quietly. Today. They do. I didn't know how to answer, so I simply smiled. She smiled back. I'll take that as a yes. When the kitchen was finally clean, Henry had already fallen asleep in his favorite chair. A blanket covered his legs. The television played softly in the background. Claire looked toward him and whispered, He always does that after dinner. He looks peaceful. He is. She smiled. He pretends he invited you here because he liked your company. I laughed. Pretends. He really invited you. Because he thought I needed someone to smile at again. For a moment, neither of us looked away. The room suddenly felt much quieter than before. Claire took a slow breath. Can we go outside for a minute? Of course. We stepped onto the porch. The night air was cool. Above us, hundreds of stars filled the sky. Claire rested her arms on the wooden railing. I need to tell you something. I waited. The day I saw you, I didn't just think you were Michael. She looked down. I also realized it was the first time in years that I'd felt hopeful about meeting someone. I stayed silent. She smiled nervously. I know that probably sounds strange. It doesn't. She looked at me. Why not? Because. I took a slow breath. I almost turned my truck around that afternoon. Her eyes widened. What? I drove past Henry. I kept going. Then something told me to stop. She smiled softly. I'm really glad you listened. So am I. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about Michael. It wasn't about the past. It was about two people who had unexpectedly found each other because one of them decided to stop and help a stranger carry firewood. We stayed on the porch longer than either of us expected. Neither of us seemed to mind the cold. The silence felt comfortable now. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just peaceful. Claire smiled as she looked out toward the trees. Grandma used to say this was her favorite place in the world. The porch. Claire nodded. She believed every important conversation happened outside. I smiled. She might have been right. A sudden cough came from inside the house. Claire looked over her shoulder. That's Grandpa. He'll pretend he's asleep if we check on him. I laughed. Really? Oh, absolutely. We quietly stepped back inside. Henry was still sitting in his chair. His eyes were closed. His hands rested on his lap. Claire whispered, See. Before she could finish, Henry spoke without opening his eyes. I'm not asleep. I couldn't help laughing. Claire folded her arms. You were listening. I wasn't listening. I was resting. There's a difference. Claire shook her head. I've heard that excuse since I was 10. Henry slowly opened one eye. So, he looked directly at me. When are you coming back? Claire immediately turned red. Grandpa. What? I'm asking. She covered her face. You are impossible. Henry smiled proudly. I've been called worse. I looked at Claire, then back at Henry. If you'll have me, I'd like to come back next weekend. Henry grinned. I was hoping you'd say that. Over the next several weeks, returning to the Morgan house became part of my routine. Sometimes I helped Henry split firewood. Sometimes Claire and I cooked dinner together. Other afternoons we simply sat on the porch drinking coffee while Henry told stories that somehow became more unbelievable every time he told them. For the first time in years, weekends felt like something to look forward to. One Saturday morning, I arrived earlier than usual. Henry wasn't outside. Claire was kneeling in the garden instead. She looked up and smiled. Perfect timing. I hope that's a good thing. It is. She handed me a pair of gardening gloves. I need help. I should have guessed. You always do. What are we planting? She held up a small tray of flower bulbs. Tulips. I looked toward the garden. I thought winter was coming. It is. She gently placed one bulb into the soil. That's why we're planting them now. I raised an eyebrow. They won't bloom until spring. She smiled. Exactly. I watched her for a moment. You know. I think you're talking about more than flowers. She looked at me. I usually am. We spent the next hour working side by side. The conversation drifted from books, to music, to places we'd always wanted to visit. It amazed me how easy everything felt. There was no pretending, no awkward silence, no trying to impress each other. Just two people slowly getting to know one another. At one point Claire suddenly laughed. What? I just realized something. What? The first time we met, I dropped my coffee. The second time, I almost cried. And today, I'm covered in dirt. I looked at the mud on her cheek. You missed a spot. She instinctively touched the wrong side of her face. No, the other side. She laughed. I knew you were going to do that. Before she could wipe it away, I reached over. Very gently, I brushed the small streak of dirt from her cheek with my thumb. For a second, neither of us moved. She looked into my eyes. I looked into hers. The whole world seemed to go quiet. Then, from somewhere behind us, Henry's voice echoed across the yard. I've been waiting 3 weeks for one of you to do that. Claire jumped back, laughing. Oh my goodness. She covered her face. Grandpa. Henry stood on the porch holding his coffee mug with the biggest smile I'd ever seen. I was beginning to think I'd have to push you two together myself. Even I couldn't stop laughing. And judging by the smile on Claire's face, neither could she. Winter slowly settled over the countryside. The trees stood bare against pale gray skies. Snow covered the old wooden fence surrounding Henry's property. The pile of firewood we'd stacked together was already half gone. You were right, Henry said one afternoon, placing another log into the fireplace. This wood didn't last nearly as long as I hoped. I laughed. I remember someone saying it would last all winter. Henry pointed at me. I also remember someone carrying most of it. Claire smiled from the kitchen. So I guess both of you were wrong. By now, the Morgan house had begun to feel strangely familiar. I no longer knocked. Henry insisted that was unnecessary. If the door's unlocked, your family. The first time he said that, neither Claire nor I knew how to respond. Now, it simply felt natural. A week before Christmas, Claire asked if I'd help her decorate the old pine tree in the front yard. Henry refused. I supervise. You two do the climbing. Claire rolled her eyes. Convenient. We carried boxes of ornaments out of the attic. Most of them were older than I was. Every decoration seemed to have a story. My grandmother made this one. Claire held up a small wooden snowflake. And this? I asked. She smiled. I made that when I was 8. It was crooked. The paint had faded. One corner was chipped. It's perfect. She laughed. It absolutely isn't. It is if someone loved it enough to keep it for 20 years. She looked at me, then quietly hung it near the center of the tree. Later that evening, the first snow began to fall. Large, slow flakes drifted through the air. Claire stepped away from the ladder. It's beautiful. It is. Neither of us moved. We simply watched the snow in silence. Finally she spoke. You know, I used to think Michael came into my life for a reason. I looked at her. Now I think he did. She smiled softly. Not because he was supposed to stay, but because one day, he would unknowingly lead me to someone else. I wasn't sure I'd ever heard anything more beautiful. Before I could answer, Henry opened the front door. Would one of you mind helping an old man? We both turned. What happened? He smiled innocently. The cookies are ready. Claire laughed. That's not an emergency. Henry shrugged. It is if they get cold. After dinner, Henry disappeared upstairs much earlier than usual. I'll leave you young people alone. Claire laughed. You're doing that on purpose. Absolutely. His bedroom door closed. The house became quiet. Only the crackling fireplace remained. Claire sat on the rug in front of the fire. I joined her. For a while, we watched the flames dance across the logs. Then she looked at me. Can I ask you one last question? You've asked plenty already. I know. But this one's important. I nodded. Ask. She took a deep breath. If you hadn't stopped your truck that day, do you think we'd ever have met? I thought about it. Longer than she probably expected. Finally, I smiled. No, I don't think we would've. She looked into the fire. I've thought about that almost every day. I gently reached for her hand. This time, she didn't hesitate. She intertwined her fingers with mine. I guess Grandpa was right. About what? She smiled. He always says, life rarely changes because of the big decisions. It changes because of the small ones you almost didn't make. I squeezed her hand. I'm really glad I made that U-turn. Claire leaned her head gently against my shoulder. So am I. Outside, snow continued falling over the quiet little house hidden among the pine trees. Inside, without either of us saying another word, it finally felt as though both of us had found exactly where we were meant to be. Christmas morning arrived with fresh snow covering the entire valley. I woke to the sound of my phone vibrating on the nightstand. Henry Morgan. I smiled before answering. Merry Christmas. His cheerful voice came through the speaker. Merry Christmas, son. I've got a problem. I laughed. I somehow knew this wasn't just a holiday greeting. It isn't. Claire made far too much breakfast. I've been ordered to call you. You've been ordered? I live with my granddaughter. I know when I'm outvoted. I couldn't stop smiling. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Good. And Jacob? Yeah. I'm glad you answered. So am I. When I arrived, Claire was already outside brushing snow off the front steps. She looked up. Merry Christmas. Merry Christmas. She walked over and, without thinking, wrapped her arms around me. It only lasted a second, but it was the first time she'd hugged me. When she stepped back, she looked slightly embarrassed. I'm sorry. I don't know why I smiled. You don't have to apologize. I liked it. A smile spread across her face. Good. Because I was hoping you'd say that. Inside, Henry had prepared enough food to feed half the neighborhood. Pancakes, bacon, fresh cinnamon rolls, hot chocolate. You weren't kidding, I said. Henry looked proud. I've been practicing this breakfast for 40 years. Claire laughed. Grandpa says that every Christmas. Because it's true. After breakfast, Henry disappeared into the hallway. When he returned, he was carrying a small wooden box. He placed it gently on the table. I've been waiting for the right day. Claire looked at him. Grandpa. He smiled. Open it. She slowly lifted the lid. Inside was an old velvet ring box. Claire looked completely confused. Grandpa. I don't understand. Henry leaned back in his chair. That belonged to your grandmother. Claire carefully picked it up. Her eyes immediately filled with tears. I haven't seen this since. I know. Henry nodded. I promised her I'd give it to the person who reminded me what family feels like. Claire looked between the ring box and me, then back at Henry. You mean? Henry smiled warmly. No, I don't mean today. He looked directly at me. And I don't mean tomorrow. But I am old enough to recognize something worth protecting. The room fell silent. I wasn't sure what to say. Neither was Claire. Finally, Henry laughed. Relax. I'm not proposing for you. That broke the tension immediately. All three of us laughed. Later that afternoon, I helped Henry carry another basket of firewood inside. As we stacked the logs beside the fireplace, he spoke quietly. You know, I've watched Claire carry a weight she never deserved. I nodded. I can see that. When Michael saved her, She spent years believing she owed her happiness to a memory. He looked at me. You've helped her realize she deserves a future too. I looked toward the living room, where Claire was hanging another ornament on the Christmas tree. I think she's done the same for me. Henry smiled. I know she has. That evening, as I prepared to leave, Claire walked me to my truck. Snowflakes drifted slowly between us. She tucked her hands into her coat pockets. I have one more confession. I smiled. I'm listening. She laughed softly. The first day you came here, I wasn't only staring because you looked like Michael. I waited. She took a deep breath. I was staring because, for the first time in years, I felt like my life was about to change. I stepped a little closer. It did. She nodded. It did. I gently took her hand. This time, there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only warmth. Behind us, the front door opened. Henry leaned out with a grin. I knew carrying that firewood was the best investment I've made all year. Claire laughed. Oh, Grandpa. He winked. Merry Christmas, you two. As we looked at each other and laughed, I realized something. Sometimes the biggest moments in life don't begin with grand plans. Sometimes they begin because you stop your truck for an elderly man struggling to carry firewood. And that small decision quietly changes everything.